Welcome to this podcast on patient involvement in designing real-world data studies. Today we'll be focusing our conversation on the importance of partnering with patients to design and deliver real-world data studies, using a social media listening case study to illustrate this. I'm Dr. Ellie Cannon, and I'm joined by Orlando Agrippa, patient advocate for sickle cell disease, and Ollie Shastri, specialty care medical team lead at Pfizer UK. Great to have you both here today. Thank you very much. So, first of all, we're going to be looking at what we really mean by real-world evidence. Obviously, that's a very sort of specialist term that people may not be familiar with. And there's an increasing emphasis now on real-world data and real-world evidence in our decision making. Could you start by telling our listeners, Ollie, what real-world data is and what your thoughts are?
So the way I look at this is if you were to give a wearable out and strap that on, you're going to be generating a whole load of data points. That's your real-world data. How we interpret that data and then apply it to a problem would be the evidence. How do we improve or increase that body of evidence to support whatever we think is or isn't happening? And that's how I see real-world data versus real-world evidence.
We're obviously talking a lot about patient involvement in terms of real-world data. That's what our podcast is about. Orlando, what does patient involvement mean to you as a patient?
I think about it in a few sort of dimensions. One, I think across every condition and every walk of life, there are sort of spectrums of or levels of education, and that is no different in sickle as a sort of community as it is in somewhere else. So for me, there's something about how does one get a good representation of the variation in patient knowledge base or whatever involved in research, and that's one category. Two, how do we ensure that patients are sort of properly embedded in the process as opposed to secondary to the process, i.e. we're simply asking you for your opinion and then we'll go away and interpret it in the way that we think you've said it, as opposed to how do we get you to describe it to us? How do you get it? How do we get you to co-create it with us and then ensure that you have the output in the way that you've understood it and helped to describe it? So I think that's what involvement probably should look like.
If you think an involved patient in a clinical trial, for example, are involved in research, but actually what we're talking about here, I think, goes one step before that.
Yeah.
It's designing that clinical trial or coming up with whatever those outcome measures might be for what we're measuring in that clinical trial to make sure it's really meaningful. So I think there are multiple points at which patients can access and be involved in these sorts of activities.
Why would you say the patient involvement is so crucial? I mean, it's obviously very empowering as well for patients.
What we need to do is involve patients at a much, much earlier stage and stop pretending we know what patients want and actually ask. I think we'll be surprised with some of the answers that we get. And if we can ensure that we're collecting outcome measures that are meaningful to patients, then whatever you're investigating, when it comes to fruition, you're going to make a difference in the world for those patients in that community. So at the moment, I think we've probably got the cart before the horse. What we need to do is go right back to basics and involve patients much, much earlier to ensure that we're collecting meaningful outcomes.
We're also living quite a different world now as well, which lends itself much more easily because of social media to real world data, doesn't it? So looking at that, can you tell us about your social media listening study?
We figured that the sickle cell community, I think, are special. There is an inherent, I would say, for historical reasons, a distrust of the medical community. And, with the publication of the No One's Listening report, for example, there are some really bad examples of where things have gone wrong in healthcare in the past. And I think patients have understandably become less engaged with the medical profession as a result of stories like that. So what patients are experiencing may not be reported in the clinical environment with healthcare professionals. But you'd be surprised what people put on social media that they would never have told their doctors. And so we had an idea that it might be an interesting source to investigate and see what the real lived experience is, a candid view, a real sort of accurate day in the life of somebody with sickle cell using their self-report from social media. Now, social media is vast. There are millions of posts and we have to comb through those. So using the AI algorithm, it made that process a lot more efficient. It was great having Orlando on board because what we could do is, I thought, hashtag SCD would be our search term. Actually, that's not what the community use. I would never have known unless we brought Orlando into it.
I think a lot of patients who live with this condition, one, they don't refer to themselves as patients. So that's a whole thing that we had to, cluster up. I think most people try to refer to themselves as warriors. And then you had different sort of subgroups of patients who were kind of clustered in different things. We did see some stuff on SCD, but we saw a lot of sickle cell warriors or warriors, etc. So we did a lot of sort of matching up these terms to be able to get the algorithm to work. I think one of the things that when Ollie and I first started to work on this, I thought this was really different, innovative, but fundamentally, I've never seen across this community anyone independently look at what are the patients saying about their care, about the unmet need, about real-world evidence, about outcomes for them, irrespective of any intervention. What is publicly available on the patient voice, and how do we amplify it with this program? So for us, or at least for me, that was one of the sort of the key reasons that we got together, because it's sort of a megaphone in a structured way for the patient voice to say, these are the things that are important to us, and these are the things that we need the gap to be closed on.
Ollie referenced the No One's Listening report, which is obviously sort of very crucial in terms of sickle cell care and, well, the fact that people within the community believe, sadly, that no one's listening. How did this go on from that? Because I suppose you didn't, you were starting to listen to people without them. I mean,
definitely if someone listened, right?
Yeah, you were starting to listen. Where does that come from in the sickle cell community? Because that is quite unique. Where does that issue come from? That there is the inequality, there isn't the sort of people listening to them, there isn't the sort of trust. Ollie mentioned the trust within the healthcare community.
I'm not the sort of nominated voice for everyone. The sort of genesis of this challenge is because sickle cell is an invisible condition, right? So there's no way for you to gauge, it's almost impossible for you to gauge how much pain I'm in or not in at the moment, right? And it doesn't matter if you think it's manufactured or if it's real. There is not an easy barometer for you to test the pain, right? I can imagine that it's difficult. And I've been to the ED a few times, and I'm a bit more intense as a patient to deal with. So my outcomes are probably a lot more, I can draw a line to what will happen, right? Whereas a lot of patients can't advocate really well for themselves.
Right,
so they turn up to the ED and the person in front of them can't figure out what is happening, like how much pain you're in. And equally, there is a sort of cross-section of individuals, clinicians, who don't really know what sickle is or sickle cell anemia is. And it's not because they didn't want to know. It's like not something that everyone gets taught.
Yeah, and we should really explain, shouldn't we, that with sickle cell disease, because it's happening within African, Caribbean communities, sort of around the country, there are going to be areas where EDs are not used to dealing with patients with sickle cell disease.
And even in the capital, where there might be, if we take sort of, I don't know, East, North, South London, there will be clinicians who are doing shifts who might not be the kind of people that normally deal with this population. So I think that has been the source of a lot of the patients voicing their opinions, saying, hey, we're not being listened to around our care, and some of us have died, some of us have come to harm, etc., and this needs to be addressed. So I think that's sort of the genesis of it.
I was only going to add that, how many other diseases can you think of that you would require sort of high-dose painkillers, which I think also raises suspicions from the emergency healthcare professionals looking after you, because it's very, as you say, there are no visible signs and there is no test that you can do. So it becomes very, very tricky. I've heard from patients that, Orlando, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, but if you're a patient going to the hospital where you're known, you have a very different experience to if you go to a hospital where you're out of area and you're not known. And if you're not coming up on, it sounds crazy, but the NHS doesn't have a joined-up computer system. And there is a huge gap between the service that you might have where you live compared to down the road. And I think that discrepancy, we need to address that.
In terms of this, removing the sort of variation in care across the country and health inequality and whatever else goes with it. I think there needs to be more robust pathways which tries to respond to this sort of no one listening and bring it closer to, we are listening. And if we bring it back to the work that Ollie kicked off and, I supported on around the social media piece using AI, etc., I think that is a really fundamental move forward in saying this is what listening looks like. You've already said it. No one's consolidated these thoughts or views or whatever. Now this is what it looks like. How do we then take it to the next step?
The patient's digital voice was something that stuck, which I thought was really nice. In pharma, we do advisory boards and things like that. And often you'd have maximum 12 people on an advisory board. So you might have, say, 12 patients, and you're asking questions. Now that's a very self-selected group of people that are engaged, people that might have certain biases because they're in the room. Actually, you go to social media, you're going to get a completely candid view. It's going to be across the board. You're going to have the people that are engaged, you can have the people that aren't engaged. So you get a very different perspective over some of this information, and actually you remove the biases associated with a self-selected group, and it's on a much grander scale because you've got hundreds of thousands of people as opposed to just a few in a room. So I think it adds a different flavour. It's not going to replace advisory boards, but it's a very quick, hopefully in the future, easy way if we're employing AI to do some of the heavy lifting on these tasks that would have been very monotonous. Hopefully it will keep us in tune with the patient communities that we serve.
And I think as well what's really important is obviously this real world data comes from patients and it's all about the patient voice, but also we're talking about patient involvement in real world data, and you collaborated with a patient to get started because you wouldn't have actually been able to design the study, look for the sort of correct terminology unless you had a patient involvement right from the outset.
Absolutely. And from the very start I wanted Orlando to be an author on this paper, and we were keeping our fingers crossed, and actually we've just put it into the journal, so let's cross our fingers even more, because I knew it would be a successful project if we set it up in the right way and made sure we used the right people. And so, Orlando did a great job of being our patient advocate, but we made sure we brought in a statistician. We made sure we engaged with our patient and real world evidence teams. So we got the right people for the job all the way through. And what was really interesting with some of the results of that study is that I assumed, and this is kind of the problem, I suppose, I made an assumption that it would be restricted to the areas that we've spoken about, so accessing healthcare. I thought that's where the big problem area would be. But actually, looking at the themes, and they're themes that you can expect, family relationships, seeking healthcare, all these sorts of things. It's across the board. The negative sentiment outweighed positive in all 6 of the categories that we found, which I think gives it's quite a shocking view about life with sickle cell, that it's not just when you're accessing healthcare, it's
crisis,
all these other parts of your life. Family planning came up, huge
Family
issues.
planning is a big deal for families within the sickle cell
conditions.
community. Yeah, absolutely. Education is a huge thing. So I should ask you, as the patient, were you surprised, like Ollie was, with the data that you saw?
I think the thing that was helpful, probably less surprising, was the reality that all of the discussions that I've heard from different patients sort of presented themselves in a really well-structured way that we could take forward. So I think reinforcing what I thought was the reality was helpful. But there was no way that one could have done it with this volume of people. As Ollie said, you can do an ad board or whatever for 10, 15, 20 people. But this is thousands upon thousands of comments coming through in a structured way that we can then package up for this research. So I think that was the most, maybe not surprising, but most kind of reinforcing piece.
And were there themes that came up that you were surprised by that you wouldn't have necessarily asked about?
I think the one thing that I didn't think that would feature as big, but it's known, would be the sort of education piece, right? So I'm sure there's somewhere in the research that spoke to the sort of need to have more education in the ED for clinicians, etc., or some version of that. But that bit, I didn't think that patients would package it up in that way. I don't know what I thought it would be, but I didn't think it would be packaged up in such a precise way to say, this is the source
So
of the problem.
so what you're saying is the community is acutely aware of the fact that there is this sort of like patchwork service,
Yeah.
and there isn't the sort of education
Exactly.
homogeneously across the service that there really should be if they're going to their
Yeah.
local hospital versus if they're somewhere else.
We saw patients understanding the broken sort of pathways or processes that needed to be fixed and calling that out to say, hey, this is where the problem is.
And you know, that's something that, you know, hopefully we can help with as industry, because we do a lot of patient education, we do a lot of HCP education. And sometimes, you know, it's easy to invest resources in areas where they're not as needed. This allows us to target those areas so that when we're putting, you know, our educational plan for the year together, we can say, well, now we've got an evidence base to support targeting this area. Let's go for the, you know, the more junior members of staff that won't be exposed to sickle cell, and we'll create an educational campaign for them specifically. So, you know, that's hopefully going to be something that we take away from this project that we can implement for next year.
Whatever happens next from this research, it feels like there is a palpable piece of education that needs to happen across the NHS. If you think about a study, right, you will have your public and patient group, and it will have some patients there. And there is sort of listening and taking feedback, and then there's active involvement, right?
Yeah.
Which is very, very,
Very
Passive
different.
and active,
Yeah.
isn't it?
And I think what most of the things that I've seen so far is we know what this study or this piece of work needs to be. Let's satisfy the requirement to involve 6, 10, 30,
It's a
whatever
tick
patients
box. It's a
done,
tick
right?
box, yeah.
But we know the patients have said these things.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's a lot of, okay, how do we truly and genuinely co-create this thing with the patients helping to engineer it? Not that I'm anything special, right? But I'm, you know, my background's in the NHS, in technology, in running companies before, in data, like all of the things that we've done, I sort of know how it works,
Yeah.
right? So I can imagine for some diseases or some conditions, getting together a group of patients to co-create something, if not carefully choreographed and managed, can be an absolute nightmare. Because you've got lots of conflicting views, and you know you can end up having a sort of a therapy session as opposed to designing something. So I think there's something about how do you balance that versus patients who are proactive but who sort of have a level of understanding of how stuff works. Because I think if you've got a lower base, it might be harder to sort of, you've got to educate people, then you've got to do another layer, and then you've got your baseline to then build on.
I think, you know, going back to the sort of the uniqueness of sickle cell, I think in you know, many other disease areas, particularly rare diseases, there's a lot of research happening and there's a lot of work going on. Now, it's no secret that sickle has been left out of that, and that those advances have not been made in sickle cell disease. So I think the reason, yes, it's an interesting sort of approach, and you could apply it to many different disease areas. But I think, you know, it probably held more weight in sickle because there was such a paucity of research in that area, and that community felt that they weren't being listened to. So it's almost a sort of a double whammy effect. If you'd done this in another disease area, there's the chance that it might not be as impactful just because there's so much other work happening in those areas. And I think it lent itself extremely well to sickle because it was an easy way of getting a large group opinion on certain issues almost overnight.
In the same way that it seems like such an organic, sensible way of gathering evidence, it's such a sensible, organic way of gathering data about patient statistics and outcomes in terms of healthcare.
I've spoken about this study a lot, and I think that people still have their reservations about the quality of the evidence because it has the word social media in it.
Yeah.
I remember when I presented this, so we were lucky enough to go to San Diego to the American Society of Hematology, and when we put this abstract in, I think I expected it might be a poster or something. It's a very competitive conference,
Very competitive.
And we got a, you know, an oral podium presentation which we were, you know, absolutely gobsmacked about.
But I think it was testament to what it was, right? This is genuinely a massive testament, and let's try to show an unedited view of this is what they this is what they're thinking. Yeah, this is what their experience is, and this is what they want, right? It gave us the ability to be able to genuinely sit and present alongside cutting edge research, because it is cutting edge, because no one else has even thought about doing it, to your question.
You have this great evidence base now of your real world data, your real world evidence. What are Pfizer doing now going forward in terms of reaching other patient groups and other diseases?
So Pfizer are committed to ensuring ongoing patient engagement, and one of the resources we've put into place is the patient involvement framework. And this is designed to give researchers the tools that they need to ensure that patients are involved at every step in the process as much as possible.
And how does that look like in terms of getting sort of people from different communities, from different diseases, from sort of all sort of different walks of life, which is so crucial?
One element of the framework is to ensure that we get that diversity of thought and opinion, which I think is really, really important to be representative of the communities that we serve.
And with your paper, you're actually looking towards involving patients also at the end of the journey as well, aren't you, when you publish the results?
We're involving patients, but then we're not necessarily very good at communicating the outcomes of that research. We want to complete that loop. So yes, we're involving patients right at the start to make sure the outputs are meaningful. But when we've generated that scientific literature and we've got it published, we've taken it to Congress, that's behind closed doors to patients. We want to make that accessible. We really want to get that message out there. And Pfizer are very committed to improving that health literacy. And Plain Language Summary is a vehicle that we can deliver that message.
So what I'm hearing, which is really great, is that actually this notion of patient involvement in real world data starts right at the beginning, with even starting to sort of how is it even going to be designed, and goes the whole way through the journey right to the end, even to the point where you want the data presented and sort of digestible to your community. So they have the data themselves, and they can utilize the data in whatever way they want.
I think the sort of overarching theme is still very much education, and education in two sort of verticals, or a few verticals, right? One, to the patient community. And it's precisely as Ollie said, we go to all of these congresses and there's lots of scientific stuff, which is really valuable, needed, and should progress in that way. But all of this data is generated from patients, about patients, and the research that relates to them. But most patients would not be able to go into a sort of poster hall and figure out what the research is, because it's not designed for that group. Whereas if we can take our research and convert it into these kind of plain language, bite size, across multiple pieces of research, then it helps us to engage volumes of people.
And what difference does that make to patients?
It's a good one. So I think it makes a palpable difference in getting more patients involved in the research, more patients.
So it's feeding back in. It's
Precisely.
Sort of like
it's like
positive.
a loop.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
Right?
Okay.
More patients involved in trials, more patients being curious about trials that are available and not available, and more patients speaking to other patients about these things. The second vertical around it is going back to we thought through the NHS, and we were shocked that they were shocked. I think that there is something about how can we distill this down and other things like it to educational sort of, packages for nurses, for junior doctors, for senior doctors on this disease, because I think that is still very much the gap, which links back to this kind of no one listening report.
To follow on with that educational piece, I think we have the luxury of having multimodal educational resources now.
Yeah.
And, the omni-channel is a word that's thrown around in the pharma industry quite a lot, but actually, it doesn't have to be printed words on a page anymore. One of the things that we're going to test with patients is, how do you like to receive information? Yeah. What works best for you? Are you a podcast person? Are you a visual person? Do you like to see things in schematics, or do you like a talking head video? And actually, by switching up the way that we can disseminate information, hopefully we'll have more retention, and maybe the message will get out there more successfully on many more channels. Let's leverage those digital resources that we have at our fingertips. I think, really interesting.
And also it's about leveraging as well the sort of symbiosis. I mean, you wouldn't know the questions to ask without the patients, and the patients wouldn't be able to have their questions answered without the pharmaceutical industry and without the healthcare professionals behind them. So it's really about making those sort of collaborations and relationships, but actually it's so mutually beneficial for the doctor in the district general hospital or for the patient who otherwise wouldn't choose a university where there is, you know, not a sickle cell centre, because they don't want to turn up in that hospital. So, you know, it's a very, very mutually beneficial relationship, and I feel very optimistic having heard you both speak. You've actually gone out to listen to the community and actually hear what they want to say, and bring them into, you know, the research and the area where they've never really felt heard. Orlando, you've described sort of very well your own unique position in wanting to be involved in this real world data yourself. What would you say to other people with sickle cell disease who wanted to be involved as a patient? What would your advice to them be?
You know, irrespective of age, genotype, education levels, I think the more diverse the patient population is, the better the research and the more representative it is. So I would encourage patients who want to participate in this type of research or any type of research or a trial or whatever it is to reach out to, be it clinicians that are leading some of these studies or companies that are doing different things, to say, hey, I've got an idea on this stuff and I'd like to have an input, or I've got an idea on a whole different set of research and I'd like to get your support on it. Because I've not met a clinician or people who are genuinely invested in research who've not entertained everyone's sort of view on how do we put something together.
That's great.
So reach out is the key.
Thank you both so much. I feel like I have learned a great deal about patient involvement, and I think to talk about sort of sickle cell in this way and for sickle cell disease to be at the forefront of this patient involvement with research with Pfizer, it makes me very optimistic about the future. So thank you, Orlando. Thank you, Ollie. And thank you to our listeners.
Thank you very much.